Om Tava Kathamritam Tapta Jeevanam Kavibhirididam Kalmashapam Sravanamangalam Srimatatam Bhuvanati Puritajam. So we are continuing the discussion. This is the condensed Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, which is a translation of the original Gospel, a fraction of the original Bengali Gospel, translated into English by Yam himself. So, at the beginning, for the first 2 days, we discussed how Yam came in contact with Sri Ramakrishna, how a most terrible domestic tragedy indirectly paved the way to Sri Ramakrishna's presence, and how gradually he became transformed and became a saint. Now we have left the last portion where Yam was introduced to Sri Ramakrishna, and Sri Ramakrishna made some preliminary inquiries. He had his first visit, but he couldn't talk for a long time. Then he continues. Yam himself translates into English. Master and disciple. Master here stands for Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. Disciple is Yam Mahendra Nath Gupta himself, the chronicler of this work. A couple of days after, at about 8 in the morning, Yam called again. Yam is the short name. He used to call himself as Yam, standing for Mahendra Nath Gupta. The master is going to be shaved by the barber. The winter cold is still lingering, and he has on a moleskin shawl hemmed with red muslin. On seeing Yam, the master says, "Well, you are here. Very good. Take your seat here." It was on the southern veranda leading to his room that the meeting took place. You should remember that when Yam met Sri Ramakrishna, saw him sitting inside the room, talking with his disciples, Yam was reminded of what he read in the great devotional classic Bhagavata Purana, which is actually an exposition of the highest spiritual truths based on the life and teachings of Sri Krishna. Shuka was instructing the great king Parikshit, who had left his kingdom, his palace, everything, and had come to the banks of Ganga, where he sat on meditation, knowing that he had only 7 days to live. So when King Parikshit asked the question, put this question to Shuka, the great saint, "I have only 7 days to live. How I should lead the rest of my days?" Atha prachami samsiddhim yoginam paramam guru purushasya yatkaryam priyamanasya sarvata. What should a dying man do? This is the essence of the question. How he should meditate, how he should go about doing his duties and performing his responsibilities. All these details. And what he should not do. Bruhi dua viparyam, that is one part of the question, which Parikshit puts to Shuka. So in answer to this, in the next chapter, probably the 19th chapter, the last chapter of the first skandha, the first book of the devotional classic, the saint talks about what we should not do. That's a very important thing. The answer that he gives is given in a nutshell, in a single verse. Etavan Sankhya Yoga Bhyam Sudharma Parinishthaya Janma Labha Parapumsam Ante Narayana Smriti. What's the final, ultimate goal of human existence? To leave this world with memory of God in our heart. This you could do either through Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, and so on. Already we gave a brief description of this on the first and second days. Then, of course, just before that, this saint answers the latter part of the question. which the king put to him. The latter part of the question was, Bruhi Yadwa Vibarium, and what a dying man should not do. In other words, what a person who actually wants to lead a very intelligent life in this world, so that he could live this world in an intelligent way, thinking of God. What such a person should be very careful not to do. What he should be very careful to avoid. But he should try to avoid. So in answer to this latter part of the question, the saint says, Shuka says, see, look at the common people. When they are children, they are busy with the toys and plays. They don't know anything. They can't think of anything about the true meaning of human existence. They are not aware of it. They are in a state of ignorance when they are very small. When they get old, they are in the prison of their own senses. They will live a very sensory life. They will be living under the tyranny of their own senses. Eating, drinking, and making the best of a material life in this world. Living at the bodily level. Interpreting oneself as a physical mechanism. Very few of the 7 billion people inhabiting this planet will interpret their own personality as a psychophysical mechanism. Mostly they interpret as a physical mechanism. Even to be able to look upon oneself as a psychophysical mechanism, you should have reached a fairly higher level of evolution. So, look at these people. When they are young, they are in a state of ignorance. They spend all their time playing, eating, merrymaking. When they are young, see, so when they are in childhood, ignorance. When they are young, then also ignorance. And when they get old, it is too late. It's too late. There's a problem for those who think that they can start a spiritual life on a later occasion, when they get old. It is impossible. Because our mind, the tendencies and impressions must have already been fully formed. See, it's like you have already programmed an intelligence into a machine, so that machine can only function according to the intelligence that you have programmed into it. It cannot take its own independent decision. Yesterday, one of our friends was reading that part of Swamiji's complete verse. A crawling worm can think for itself and decide and exercise its own freedom of action by moving out of the railway track. But a locomotive, which is much more powerful, much faster, cannot take that decision. So, when if we think that we can start a spiritual life when we get old, leading a very bohemian life till 50th or 60th year, they are terribly mistaken. It is impossible. We cannot start a new chapter in our life that way. Whatever impressions, whatever tendencies we have already accumulated, they will constitute a strong force that will drag us backward towards itself. And if those tendencies and impressions are not conducive, not helpful to leading a spiritual life, then they will not only not help us, but they will actually pull us backward from spiritual track. So we should start spiritual life when we are young. In fact, one of the greatest mythological devotees, a great devotee, whom Sri Ramakrishna refers on innumerable occasions with great ecstasy and devotional fervor, was Prahlada. He said, Kaumara Acharya Pratyaka. An intelligent person should start when he or she is quite young, boyhood or girlhood. So, Yam was reminded of all these scenes that he had become familiar with, reading that great devotional classic of Bhagavata Purana. That brought him back to the Dakshineshwar temple. He came alone this time. His nephew possibly said, well, I am not coming, once is enough. Siddheshwara Majunda took him to Sri Ramakrishna's temple, the temple garden, on the first occasion. They were moving from place to place, visiting different temple gardens on the Ganges. But this time, probably Yam came himself, because he was the one who was caught into the spiritual trap of Sri Ramakrishna. So he felt like coming back again. He himself said, well, something seems to attract me to this place. Something great, something sublime about this man and what he is saying. So Yam returns. A couple of days after, at about 8 in the morning, Yam called again. So that's the scene. Sri Ramakrishna was sitting outside on the veranda. So Sri Ramakrishna asked him, where is your home? Yam replies, in Kolkata. With whom have you been staying here at Baranagar? With my sister, sir, at Ishan Kaviraj's house. And the dialogue continues. And then Sri Ramakrishna asked a very important question, which really indirectly leads to a very important topic in spiritual life. In fact, it indirectly leads to some very strong pronouncements from Sri Ramakrishna, very important pronouncements from Sri Ramakrishna, which constitute the essence of devotional life. Yam is sitting before Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna asks, are you married? Yam said, yes, sir. Sri Ramakrishna startled at these words, said, Hobby, he has already taken a wife, may the Lord help him. Now, we should not draw any wrong conclusion in this context. Sri Ramakrishna had a great affection, great consideration for devotees who are married. Most probably, Sri Ramakrishna must have had in his mind, but this young man, who appears to be a spiritually oriented person, a devotee by birth, if he is free from all these domestic obligations, he can do much more work, much better work on behalf of God, for spreading the word of God. In fact, incidentally, that was the very task which Sri Ramakrishna had already earmarked for him, for Yam, which Yam was the one who started writing down all of Sri Ramakrishna's instructions in his diaries, which now we can read as the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. So at these words, Yam was covered with confusion. He sat speechless, hanging down his head like one guilty of a serious offense. He then says to himself, is marrying then so wicked? Master, have you any children? Yam can hear the beating of his own heart. Yes, sir, he answers in a feeble voice. It was this problem which actually drove him away from his own home. Suppose Yam was a single person leading very happy life. Possibly he would not have felt the need to get out of his home at midnight and seek refuge in the home of his own nephew, and then eventually come to the Dakshineshwar and be introduced to Sri Ramakrishna by his own fate. So, Yam was somewhat startled. The master is shocked. He rebukes Yam, saying, alas, and there are children too to bring up. You should remember the background. Sri Ramakrishna had a great affection for people, for youngsters, young spiritual seekers, who want to be completely free from all domestic shackles and obligations, and who had led pure life right from their boyhood days. Because they could take they could spread his message all over the world. That's how he trained, that's why he trained so many great young disciples. Swami Vivekananda, Swami Brahmananda, Swami Shivananda, all many others, 16 disciples. They were all trained by Sri Ramakrishna. They were all unmarried, young spiritual seekers. So possibly Sri Ramakrishna thought that Yam also actually belongs to the galaxy, the same level of spiritual masters. So Yam feels that a terrible blow has been dealt to his egotism. Remember, you have to look at Yam. He was a well-educated man who had worked as a headmaster, had a huge family to support, not poor but certainly not very affluent, and he was also attracted towards some of the elite intellectual circles of the city of Kolkata, where Keshav Chandra Sen, whom we meet after some time in this gospel, and Vijay Krishna Goswami, and several others were giving lectures, preaching about the teachings of Brahma Samaj. So Yam was very much a part of this intellectual elite life of the city. So he had some sense of pride, intellectual pride. That may be the reason why Sri Ramakrishna wanted to give him a slight blow to make his disciple, the future chronicler, the future, sometimes you call it, John the Baptist of Sri Ramakrishna, as they call him. Jim was the John the Baptist of Sri Ramakrishna, one of the modern biographers, interpreters of Sri Ramakrishna's message calls him. So he had high ideas, high plans for Yam. After a while, the master looks up kindly and says in a very affectionate tone. So Sri Ramakrishna possibly wanted to give a small blow so that the disciple will come down to the proper level where he can mold him into the great saint that he was going to become in future. You see, my boy, there are some very good signs about you. I know them by looking at the eyes and the brow. The eyes of the yogis have a peculiar look, and that in previous incarnations passed the days in communion with God and meditation. In the case of some, it seems as if they have just left the seat of divine contemplation. So, Sri Ramakrishna used to read the character of spiritual seekers by looking at their face. Too much of extrovert enthusiasm, too much of going about with wide open eyes, looking at the external sublimities or wonders of the world. All these Sri Ramakrishna did not like. At the same time, there were some spiritual seekers with slightly indrawn eyes, who were of an introspective type. Yam belonged to that category. Yam, Swami Vivekananda, and many other direct disciples belonged to this category. They were already carrying with them this wonderful legacy of leading a spiritual life in their previous incarnations. So Sri Ramakrishna could easily understand this looking at their face. That's why in the Bhagavata Purana there is a interpretation of the Lord Bhagavan himself. What is the difference between an incarnation of God and an ordinary human being? A great spiritual person, an incarnation of God, can see the whole thing in one dimension. They can see the past, present and future as a single dimension. It's like seeing the whole iceberg, not just tip of the iceberg, which projects out above the water level, but seeing the whole iceberg which is submerged within water level. Like that, a great spiritual teacher can have a vision of the whole truth as one dimension. For ordinary spiritual seekers and ordinary people, they can interpret life and events only as past, present and future. These are all artificial lines drawn on water surface. In fact, there is no past. The so-called past we experienced only in the form of the present. And the so-called future also we experience only in the form of the present. So past and future are really artificial imaginations. But then common people cannot see the whole of iceberg. They could see only the tip of the iceberg, 10 feet above the water level. Maybe the iceberg has 90 feet below the water level. But an incarnation of God can look at a person and see his past, his present, and also as the future, as looking upon the whole iceberg. So Sri Ramakrishna says, I know them by looking at the eyes and the brow. Well, now your wife, what do you think of her? Is she of a divine nature, leading Godward or to light, or the reverse, leading only to darkness and away from God? Sri Ramakrishna says there are two types of partners and wives and husbands. In both ways you can say. It could maybe with Sri Ramakrishna, if you are talking to women devotees who would have asked, maybe what about your husband? Is he the type of person who tell you don't go to temples, don't go to churches? Or is he the type who will encourage you, who will help you in your spiritual life? So Sri Ramakrishna is asking this question. So Yam says, she is good enough but ignorant. Most probably he must have meant that she was not so well educated. In those days, women's education was not so widespread as these days in India. So most probably Yam was a postgraduate of those days. And maybe his wife was certainly not at all well educated. At the most maybe barely literate. That must be what he meant when he said, but ignorant. So Sri Ramakrishna gets a chance to give him another blow so that he can bring his disciple to the right level where he would be receptive enough to understand the teacher's, the master's instructions. Master says sharply, she's ignorant and you are wise. You think you attain wisdom, do you? So Sri Ramakrishna didn't like the way Yam must have uttered that she is ignorant. Yam knows not what wisdom and what ignorance truly consist in. His idea is that a wise man is he who reads books. This false notion was of course afterwards taken away, and he was then taught that to know God is alone true wisdom and not to know him ignorance. Remember, these are Yam's own translations. So he writes within paragraph. This false notion which Yam had, that wisdom means reading books, and the absence of wisdom is not reading anything. When the master said, do you think you have attained wisdom? Yam's egotism received a second blow. Of course, remember, he was such a great man, Yam. He was himself a true disciple, and his level of spiritual fitness to be a disciple of Sri Ramakrishna was so high that all these apparent rebukes and sharp words had the desired effect on him. So he could understand more and more the true nature of wisdom, the true nature of knowledge. And he slowly becomes very receptive, very polite, humble disciple. Master, now Sri Ramakrishna turns to some subjects, some other topics related to Yam's own spiritual practices, his ideal of God, what kind of God whom he was meditating upon, whether he believed that God had a form or whether he thought that God was formless, whether he was a a devotee of God with form and attributes, or whether he was a non-dualist Advaita. So that's a topic of discussion now. Do you like to meditate upon God as with form or without form? This question makes him look confused and sets him thinking. Is it then possible that one could have faith in the formless God and at the same time believe that he has a form as well? Or if one believed God to be with form, how could one also think that God is formless? Could two contradictory attributes coexist in the same substance? Could white things like milk be black and also at the same time be white? A very interesting discussion. Now, really speaking, Sri Ramakrishna's central message was that God could be either formless or with form. Both are right. In our spiritual tradition, we are never traveling from error to truth. We are traveling from one level of consciousness, one level of understanding to a higher level of understanding. So, according to Swami Vivekananda, who later interpreted Sri Ramakrishna's ideas and messages in modern language, one begins with the dualistic form of worship. It means when you start your spiritual life, you may have some idea of God, name, attributes, certain like omniscience, all knowledge, omnipotence, all power, omnipresence, being of an all-pervading nature, the immanent, Skandaryami, the inner resident, present in all beings. Well, these are some of the qualifications. But before this stage, we may think that God creates His world. He is compassionate, He is merciful, He has a form. We can worship that God with form in an image, and we can perform some rituals. And gradually, as we evolve spiritually, our understanding of God also evolves. Our concept of the absolute reality also evolves, and at a later advanced stage, we realize that there is nothing but God everywhere. God is omnipresent, all-pervading reality. But this is a gradual path that we must attain through practical spiritual life, through spiritual practices. It is not belief in a doctrine or a dogma or a system of philosophy. It is a practical evolution through spiritual practices. We evolve from an incomplete understanding of the absolute reality towards a more and more complete understanding of the absolute reality, God. This perhaps Yam did not understand, because in those days it was fashionable to read books and give, like an interpret. Maybe traditional teaching and discussion of Vedantic Scriptures was not very prominent in this part of the country, according to Swami Vivekananda. So even Keshav Chandra Sen himself was, according to modern historians, giving a kind of semi-mystical, westernized, Christianized interpretation of Upanishadic philosophy. Keshav Chandra Sen was the most prominent intellectual figure of the city at that time. And Yam was a part of these intellectual circles. So naturally he could not understand what Sri Ramakrishna was talking about. God can have a form depending upon where you stand. God is beyond form, beyond attributes. For the highest Advaita, because it's a high level of spiritual realization. But we can't say when we reach a higher level of education, we don't throw the books, We don't completely disbelieve, we don't reject what we have already learned at the previous classes. What we learn at the master's level or the PhD level are built upon, based upon what we study at the primary level. You use the same alphabet even when you are writing a thesis or getting a PhD degree. You don't use something else other than the alphabet that you may have picked up when you were a child. So, the spiritual realization, the Advaitic realization is a higher and more complete understanding of the same reality. And dualistic worship is also equally true. Both are equally true and correct. This is the traditional interpretation of Vedanta, which Yam was possibly not familiar with. That's why he couldn't understand this. But Sri Ramakrishna had all this from his own experience. He could teach all this from his own personal experience. So after thinking for a while, Yam said, I should like, sir, to meditate upon God as the formless rather than as a being with form. Again, another point, remember, Yam must have said this much, but he must have said with a sense of pride. There was some kind of assumed pride among the intellectuals when they asserted, well, I believe in Advaita. I don't believe in this image worship, temples, going to churches. No. Actually, no real Advaitin will have this kind of false egotism or assertiveness. A true Advaitin will have the highest Advaitic conviction. At the same time, he will not stop praying, he will not stop reading books, he will not stop the rituals. Well, before concluding this part of the discussion, to drive home this idea of what Sri Ramakrishna means, when Sri Ramakrishna says that God with form and God without form are equally correct. I will tell you one interesting incident. There was a great Shankaracharya of Sringeri. Most probably he lived, he was the abbot of the great month of Adi Shankaracharya, Sringeri Shankaracharya. At the beginning of 20th century, he was supposed to be a highly evolved person, a realized person. So it is said that when Sri Ramakrishna passed away, immediately he was doing Aratriga in the temple where they performed puja for the Chandramaulishwara temple, Sharada, Adi Shankaracharya's images. They do puja regularly. So immediately he made the statement, he said that a great soul has left this world, something like that. Now, he was such a highly respected saint of those days in the first half of 20th century. So, but he was always engaged in doing puja, reading and recitation and so on. But it was well known that he was a great exponent of Advaita, non-dualistic system of philosophy. So somebody asked him, well, you are an Advaitin, you are a realized soul, so why do you spend your time in these rituals, doing Aratriya, puja, recitation and so on? Then it is said that he turned back and asked a counter question, then what else should I do? Now, how do you expect a spiritually advanced soul to spend his time? You remember yesterday we read Sri Ramakrishna makes a mocking statement. A man who says, I can't keep quiet, so I am erecting a fence. People who cannot keep quiet, they become very proud, so I am playing cards. So what kind of physical activity will a spiritually evolved person be engaged in? Not that he should do that, but there is no rule that he should not do that. An Advaitin, a non-dualist, transcends all these vidhi and nisheta, mean injunctions, all kinds of injunctions. There is no law that he should not do dualistic worship, dualistic practice. And there is no law that he should do either. He transcends, he goes beyond these do's and don'ts of ritualism. So he asked this question, what else should I do? So the question is, even a highly evolved Advaitin, non-dualist, will never condemn, he will never look down upon image worship, prayers, and all days dualistic rituals. They will have equal respect for this. Remember, spiritual growth is not belief, not like belief or conviction of an ism or a philosophical doctrine. There is a difference about this, To be very precise, going beyond this level, I shall make a few remarks about the background of Yam's confusion. And that is related to some of the characteristic, special features of Western philosophy. In Western philosophy, if A is right, then A alone is right and B should be wrong. That's the point. So Kant demolishes British empiricism and all the previous systems of philosophy. In Vedanta, when you transcend all the dualistic level and reach Advaita, non-dualistic systems, non-Advaitic systems do not become wrong. No, Advaita transcends, goes beyond the dualistic level. It doesn't contradict dualism. It is all accommodating, all inclusive one, not all exclusive one. There could be two types of one. This is one, the other is something else. But Advaita is, it is called non-dualism. It is really speaking not monism. Monism, as it is understood in Western theological context, should not be very accurate in the context of describing Advaita. So Advaita is not monism, it is non-dualism. So this monism implies the possibility of plurality, which you deny. Non-dualism does not deny the possibility of duality or plurality, but says it is beyond pluralism and dualism. So all-inclusive one, that is Advaita. Yam did not understand this. So Yam thought, if God has a form, then there cannot be any concept of God without form. And if God is formless, then the idea of God with form ought to be wrong. This is a very serious blunder which we are likely to make if we look upon Vedanta philosophy through the prism of modern Western philosophical training. And Yam was fully trained in that area. Yam was familiar with all these modern Western philosophical ideas. So that should be understood. But Sri Ramakrishna says, the highest spiritual experience is one all-inclusive one. It accommodates, includes everything. It doesn't deny, it doesn't reject. It gives everything its own place. But then this experience transcends all dualistic, non-Advaitic levels of experience. Not that one is wrong, the other is right. No. The one experience accommodates and goes beyond all the other levels of experience. It doesn't contradict, it doesn't come in conflict with the other levels of experience. It just transcends it. So Yam will quickly understand this, mind you. In course of time, if you read the Gospel and if you read the life of Yam, you will understand Yam finally becomes the greatest Advaitin and also the greatest Bhakta. He was fully convinced of the truth of Advaita. At the same time, he becomes a great devotee who spent all his time spreading the message of his master, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Master replies, Sri Ramakrishna replies, that's good. There is no harm in looking at him from this or from that point of view. Yes, to think of God as the formless being is quite right. But take care you do not run away with the idea that that view alone is true and all others are false. That's what Sri Ramakrishna warns him against. Meditating upon him as a being with form is equally right. But you must hold to your particular point of view until you realize, until you see God, when everything will become clear. When we reach the experience level, then we fully understand that the so-called non-Advaitic level of experience is also true. But the Advaitic experience transcends all other levels of experiences. At this, Yam becomes once more speechless. Because the spiritual instruction that Sri Ramakrishna gives, Yam had so far only received philosophical instructions. And in philosophical instruction, if A is right, B is wrong. You can't say B is also right, you can't say. That goes against the logic and epistemology of philosophy. So at this, Yam becomes once more speechless. He hears again and again from the lips of the master that contradictory theories are true of God. The so-called contradictions are contradictions only at the philosophical level. At the experience level, the so-called contradictions are not contradictions. They are only partial realization, still realization of the truth. Never has he come across so strange a thing in all his books, and to these his learning is confined. Good language, you have to understand. His egotism has received another blow. All the philosophical training, Kant and Hegel and Spencer, Mill, all vanished in front of Sri Ramakrishna. His egotism has received another blow, and it is not yet completely knocked down and crushed. So he goes on questioning and reasoning a little with the master. Yam needed a few more blows, and then he was ready to be the chronicle of Sri Ramakrishna. Yam says, "Then, sir, one may hold that God is with form, but surely he is not the earthen images that are worshipped." Yam may not have used a very complimentary language. There is an exclamation mark. He himself must have put it. Master says, "My dear sir, why should you call it an earthen image? Surely the image divine is made of the spirit." Yam cannot follow this. He goes on. "But is it not one's duty, sir, to make it clear to those who worship images that God is not the same as the clay forms they worship, and that in worshipping that they should keep God himself in view and not the clay images?" Sri Ramakrishna again comes back with a heavy blow. Look here, Sri Ramakrishna very strongly criticizes this tendency. Well, these people are ignorant, so it's my business to go about teaching them. The typical attitude. And Sri Ramakrishna is very much aware of this tendency of people who are getting education in those days, mind you. So these poor people, they are worshipping the temples. They think that these are all images. So we should go and tell them, look here, you have to understand this much. It's our duty. That is Yam's views. Sri Ramakrishna says sharply, "It has grown to be a fashion with you Calcutta people. No offense meant, mind you. To think and talk only of lecturing and bringing others to light. Pray, how are you going to bring light unto your own self? Who are you to teach others?" See, Yam said, "Sir, that is true. It's God whom they are worshipping. But these ignorant folk think that they are worshipping the earthen image. So we must go and tell them. We know, so we should go and teach them." As if spirituality is something that we should go about distributing, saving people's soul. That's the idea. Saving people's soul. Before saving our own soul. The Lord of the universe will teach mankind if need be. That Lord who has made the sun and the moon, men and brutes, the Lord who has made things for them to live upon, who has made parents to tend and rear them, that Lord who has done so many things, will he not do something to bring them also to light? Surely, if need, he will. He lives in the temple of the human body. He knows our inmost thoughts. Is there anything wrong in image worship? If there is anything wrong in image worship, does he not know that all the worship is meant for him? He will be pleased enough to accept that, knowing that it was meant for him. Why must you worry yourself about things about you and beyond your reach? Seek to know and revere God yourself. Love God. That's the duty nearest to you. In another context, Sri Ramakrishna says, suppose a small baby calls her or his mother. She won't be able to fully pronounce correctly according to either American pronunciation or King James Version. Mother's name or father's name. That baby will make some kind of a sound, but mother won't take offense. You are not uttering my name correctly. Mother will understand the baby is addressing the mother. Maybe a well-educated son of hers may address her properly. But mother is not going to show greater affection to the grown-up son who pronounces the mother's name properly than to the little baby who is not able to utter correctly. Sri Ramakrishna takes up this same subject on another occasion. So don't worry about correcting other people. You can spread the message. Remember, Sri Ramakrishna is not against teaching people, discussing ideas. What he meant here was, this man, young man, who was so proud of whatever book learning he had just received from the university. He was a young man, mind you, and fresh from the university. He was an householder, but in those days, youngsters used to marry when they were 15 or 16 or 17 years old. This man must have been at least below 30 years old. He was quite young at that time. But he took upon himself the task of going about telling people, look here, you should keep this idea in mind when you worship in the temple. And Sri Ramakrishna gave a strong, sharp reply to bring him down to the senses and the sense of humility. That's the only idea behind. Yam's egotism is not completely crushed. He thinks in himself, what this God man says is indeed perfectly true. So he had the wisdom, the culture, the humility to understand. Not all people will have that humility, and not all people will become Mahendra Nath Gupta, the great chronicle of the gospel either. So what business have I to go about preaching to others? Have I myself known God? Do I love God? It is, as the proverb has it, like bidding my friend, etc. Shankara, lie down on my bed, etc. So I myself don't have a house, so I'm inviting somebody else to stay in my home. Thus was Yam's first attempt to argue a point with the master, and happily the last. Sri Ramakrishna very frequently repeats this idea. In fact, he fully encouraged some sincere devotees to ask questions, to verify the meaning of what he was preaching. In fact, he encouraged his young disciples like Narendra Datta and others who are highly qualified spiritual seekers to argue with him, and he was very happy to be tested by sincere seekers. But he could never stand intellectual egotism. People who believe that we can analyze thread by and we can explain and logically analyze all aspects of spiritual life. So on some occasions he told them argument cannot be carried on beyond the limits. So Master says here, you are talking of images made of clay. Well, there often comes a necessity of worshipping even such images as these. God himself has provided these various forms of worship. The Lord has done all this to suit different men in different stages of knowledge. In a way, this is the central thrust of Sri Ramakrishna's teaching, and the very purpose for which he incarnated was to teach the world that every religion is equally a valid path leading to the same goal, namely God realization. So, from a spiritual point of view, there cannot be such a thing as a false religion, as a wrong religion. If the spiritual seeker is sincere and honest, if his mind is pure, and if he leads a very unselfish life, if he is not after name and fame, then his path, whatever may be the path, will take him to the highest spiritual realization. Whatever may be his religion, whatever may be the path that he adopts. This great truth which Swami Vivekananda taught later all comes from Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. All these rebukes, sharp words that he uttered to teach his affectionate disciple Young, they constitute the real source of all the great teachings which later came to this world from Swami Vivekananda. Simple words, simple ideas. The mother so arranges the food for her children that everyone gets what agrees with him. Suppose she has 5 children. Having a fish to cook, she makes different dishes out of it. She can give each one of the children what suits him exactly. One gets rich pulao with the fish, while she gives only a little soup to another who is of a weak digestion. She makes a sauce of sour tamarind for the third, fries the fish for the fourth, and so on, exactly as it happens to agree with the stomach. Don't you see? Simple ideas in simple imageries. Yes, sir, now I do. The Lord is to be worshipped in the image of clay as a spirit by the beginner. The devotee, as he advances, may worship him independently of the image. Really speaking, in the Mantra Shastra, in the science of image worship, this is to be understood. The image itself is completely forgotten. The devotee's intense concentration of coming out of his purity, coming out of his own spiritual realization, is transmitted to the image, and the presence of the Lord takes place in that image. So, it is out of the realization, the spiritual experiences of the worshipper, that image gets the divine dimension. And later the worshipper withdraws that presence of the Lord to himself, and the image is later sometimes merged with the ocean or water. So this is a point to be remembered. Nobody worships an earthen image or a clay image. Sometimes this is terribly misunderstood by people who don't know the spiritual psychology behind image worship. Nobody worships images. Another point, everybody worships some kind of image. Even in the religious traditions where image worship is apparently denied. Any image means, image is a symbol. It need not necessarily be a visible, a tangible form. If you turn in one direction to pray, that direction is called dik in Sanskrit, it becomes image. If you take a book and consider that book as holy, that becomes a symbol. Similarly, image is also a symbol. So, it is impossible for anyone to start spiritual life without the aid of a symbol. Otherwise, you think that spirituality is just a dogma, a doctrine, or an ism. So, our mind and senses are distracted in all directions. They should be drawn towards a higher spiritual focus. For that, we need a counter focus, a focus that helps us to withdraw the senses and mind away from the sensory objects outside. And then this focus is later turned to God. A beginner cannot turn this focus inward to his own inner temple, his own heart, where God is seated. Before reaching that stage of high spiritual evolution, he needs a symbol. The symbol acts as a counter focus, which helps you to withdraw all the senses and mind away from the external objects and then concentrate on the symbol. And you feel the Lord all-pervading God, the immanent reality, is specially manifesting on that symbol. But the degree of that manifestation of the divine is in direct proportion to this intensity of the devotion of the worshipper. Is the worshipper who actually renders divinity to the symbol. Symbol doesn't become divine. It's an essential principle. That's why, in direct proportion to the greatness of the worshipper, the manifestation of the divine increases or decreases in that temple or maybe the church also. How does a church become so divine? So many great mystics and devotees going and praying. Then that church atmosphere assumes a spiritual dimension or any place of worship. A number of great devotees gather together in a place and meditate and contemplate on the divine. That divine vibration will give a special spiritual atmosphere to that place. And the Lord's power manifests there. So also an image. Image is one of the symbols. Om is also a symbol. There are so many symbols. Every religion has one symbol or other. It is outright lie to say that my religion is free from all symbols and images. Absolutely. Otherwise, why can't you turn to the sky while praying? Why should you turn in one direction? Why should you read one book? Which all these are images. These images are necessary. But the ultimate goal of all worship is to go beyond the symbols and to finally realize the seat of the Lord within one's own heart, and simultaneously to realize the presence of the Lord in the whole creation. So all these ideas Yam will understand gradually. So towards the end of his life, he spent all his energy and time in spreading the word of Sri Ramakrishna. He compared himself as somebody sitting near the Ganga, the holy Ganga. And anybody who came to him, he gave them a picture of the holy water of Ganga. That was the message of Sri Ramakrishna. So, now we have taken enough time. We will continue this discussion tomorrow, and tomorrow will be the conclusion of this retreat program. So you can have discussion now. We have about 30 minutes left.
Swami, you talked at the beginning about Ramakrishna seeing positive signs in M,
Yes.
and having some future plans for him, in terms of spreading his word, which was truly, obviously, M's future. But for a lot of the young men who came to him, it seemed in reading from the Gospel and in the Great Master that his biggest concern about them not getting married and having children was that then they could go deeper into their own spiritual life and realization, that it wasn't so much about them being able to spread his word. Is that true?
Yes, it's true. Only in Yam's case, it was so. But in the case of many youngsters, he felt probably that many youngsters, if they could directly take to spiritual life exclusively, without any domestic obligation, that will help them to grow spiritually. But you have to remember, we have to read the whole book, then you will understand that the majority of visitors who came to Sri Ramakrishna were householders. Mm-hmm. And he was very, very positive. He, in one context, said, "You are like Janaka." And Janaka was the great king, the great philosopher king of ancient India, who was one of the greatest spiritual men of wisdom of those days, but he was ruling a kingdom. So, like that, Sri Ramakrishna often encouraged and he appreciated householder devotees, Devendranath Tagore, and several others. Baburam, Belur Math. Belur Math was a great devotee. He was the one who supported the entire organization. and also the monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, Belur Math, so many others, innumerable, not one. So, but when a great teacher spreads his message, he has to address spiritual seekers of different categories, belonging to different levels. That's key.
Swamiji, there is a famous Sanskrit paragraph, I don't know whether it's in verse or anything, in which worship is given categories, and the highest worship is identity with the divine.
Yes.
Could you tell me where that is?
Well, the verse is, if you can later write down, I will recite. Prathama Pratima Puja Japastotrani Madhyamaha Uttama Dhyana Bhavasya Soham Bhavuttamottama. This is the verse. So the verse meaning is this. Pratima Puja here means image worship. Worship, Pratima should be understood as symbol. Image is one of the symbols. Image is the simplest one. So that Omkara was a symbol, and taken for among many groups. See, among the 6, the book is a symbol, the book containing the teachings of the teacher, and so on. So it should be understood as external rituals. That's all. External ritual is the first part, the first stage in the evolution of spiritual life. And that is very gross. See, when we are engaged in different activities, our mind may be functioning at a very gross level. So it may not be easy for us to sit and meditate and contemplate. Somewhat more subtle and more abstract way of spiritual practice. So we can do external rituals, reading, worship, and so on. A still more advanced form of worship, Japastotrani Madhyamaha, means taking the name of the God, reciting God's name, or reciting hymns, may reading holy scriptures. All these are still more advanced. So if you can feel the presence of God only with some external rituals, it means you are a beginner. If you can feel the presence of God even without going to a place of worship, even while sitting in your drawing room, study room, reading a holy book, reciting, taking the name of God, then you have reached a higher level of spiritual growth. The primary motive, the fundamental motive is to bring the idea of God into our mind. For that, the beginners may need external ritualistic worship. More advanced people may not need that. They need not go to a church or a temple or any such external place of worship. They can sit and they can read, they can recite, they can chant in the name of God. Uttama Dhyana Bhavasya, the still more advanced form where you can sit and meditate on God. For that you don't need books, you don't have to recite God's name loudly, you don't have to perform any external rituals. If you have reached a fairly advanced level of spiritual evolution, then we can effortlessly turn our mind to God. All great spiritual seekers, highly evolved spiritual seekers could do that. You may be sitting in the marketplace, maybe the train or anywhere. Still you can think of God. That is where your mind automatically goes towards the God idea. Just as for ordinary people, mind automatically goes towards worldly objects. For the advanced spiritual seeker, the mind automatically goes towards God. That is Uttama Dhyana Bhavasya. The last and highest state is feeling the presence of God within oneself, where you live in a perpetual communion with God. There is complete unity of the spiritual seeker and God Himself, where you live in God and God lives in you. This is the highest. The words you can remember: Prathama Pratima Puja Japastotrani Madhyamaha Uttama Dhyana Bhavasyat Soham Bhavottama. Last one is, I am that, absolutely I am that God. Where you feel your unity with the all-pervading divine reality. God lives in you and you live in God.
In the references, like, we actually see that Yam agrees that his ego was blown. His ego, he realized that his ego was blown, like when Sri Ramakrishna asked him some questions.
Yes.
But in our instances, like, our thought process starts off saying that how did that person actually ask that question?
Excuse me?
Like in our regular interactions with people, or like when our thought process starts off with like, why did that person ask that question? Kind of. We don't actually even leave it all accepting. We actually think it doesn't even go that our ego is hurt. Like, we don't even kind of start off there.
Well, on the one hand, we have a great teacher like Ramakrishna. On the other hand, we have a great disciple, great spiritual seeker, a great candidate for spiritual life like you. Otherwise, normally many people will feel hurt and they won't go there again. Normal person. But to him, it felt a blow that came as a blessing. But so his egotism was the egotism that is natural for genuine spiritual seekers. It is a natural stumbling block which God Himself arranges for you to go get round. That's idea.
But many times, Sri Ramakrishna, if you read the words, would seem to be insulting somebody or offending them, and yet they are never offended by him. So there is something about Sri Ramakrishna that could deliver harsh, seemingly harsh messages without offending the devotee. I mean, he actually would encourage the devotee by that approach.
True. Those who got some good blows, substantial blows from Sri Ramakrishna became saints and sages. But remember, we should know, Yam records the dialogue that took place in his presence. So most of those who were in that room were spiritual seekers. So there could have maybe some other type of people must have come, and Sri Ramakrishna must have tried to correct them. It depends upon the teacher and also the fitness of the disciple. But all genuine spiritual seekers got a new life from Sri Ramakrishna. And again, his heart was open to the whole humanity. So you find in him, he never meant to hurt anybody or to offend anybody. So nobody felt it. See, very often it depends upon the type of person who is speaking those words. See, if you are scolded by your affectionate grandmother, you won't consider as words of hostility. At least normal human beings won't do that. But the same words, the same phrases uttered by a stranger, you may have a different view, you may interpret differently. So very often, words assume meaning not only from the dictionary, not only from the philological, linguistic mechanism, but also from the heart of the speaker, who renders meaning and implications to the words. That's the idea behind it.
How to make ourselves receptive? How to make ourselves receptive?
Well, when if we can enjoy reading these books, it shows that we are receptive. Very often, people can develop higher and higher interest in spiritual life by reading, by analyzing life around us, and that will help us to become more appreciative of these ideas. Right? We have to remember the same Sri Ramakrishna slowly trained his own disciple to be the great exponent of his own message. Sri Ramakrishna says you go about giving lectures and teaching others. But same Sri Ramakrishna was slowly training Yam to be the great teacher that he later became. So his idea was to bring him down to the level of a great spiritual teacher. Before that, the common idea of fashionable people in those days, see, the educated people should go and throw light in the lives of the ignorant people. Ignorant people are to be saved from ignorance. So we are sitting on a high pedestal. So we give something to other people. So we should be very kind towards them. They should be grateful to us both. In fact, Sri Ramakrishna was strongly critical of this attitude. Every act is a service, not a charity. That is his idea. If you don't have any questions, I can continue reading till 11:30 for 30 minutes more. We have only one more session. So. Here, Sri Ramakrishna is discussing a very important topic in spiritual life in general. Yam asked one question, Sir, how may one fix one's mind on God? Sri Ramakrishna speaks about the importance of solitude. To that end, one must chant without ceasing the name of God and His great attributes. One ought always to seek the company of holy men and holy women. One must always go among the Lord's devotees or those that have given up things of this world for the sake of God. It is hard, no doubt, to fix one's mind on God in the midst of the world's cares and anxieties. Hence, one must go into solitude now and then in order to meditate on Him. In the first stage of one's life in spirituality, one cannot do without solitude. So the psychology of prayer in solitude is a very important topic in spiritual life. When we pray in a congregation, in group, it is good. It is certainly beneficial. But our mind may be distracted towards people around us, and mind may not be fully indrawn. But when we pray in solitude, we are sure that nobody is watching and we are not being observed by anybody. So what happens? Prayer becomes more intense. Well, if you are praying in congregation, you may not scratch your hair even if you feel, because people may watch you. So you have to put up a very, very formal, prayerful expression on your face. That's very important. But so there you give allowance to people's appreciation or otherwise, or how we behave, which means we are aware of people around. And so long as we are aware of people around, part of our mind goes to that awareness. I mean, keeping up the right posture, the right expression, etc. And the other part only goes to meditation, prayer, God. But when we are in solitude, there is nobody to worry about. There is no need to bother about. So we can be alone with God. In fact, prayer in solitude is much more effective than congregational prayers. But it doesn't mean that congregational prayer is bad. In fact, it sometimes helps the beginners. The beginners will feel, well, all others are sitting or closing their eyes or chanting with so much of reverence. So I should not, at least I should try to be like them. For the beginner, this is a promotion actually. At least they will rise up to their level, the level of the people in the congregation. For the beginner. So one should continue with your congregational prayers. But that is only for the beginner. Prayers become more effective and meditation becomes more effective when we do that in solitude. I have seen when I was invited to talk in yoga centers back in India, international yoga centers. They will be sitting in Padmasana, kind of lotus posture, with grim expression on their face, all muscles. It means they are putting so much of effort. In real yogic posture, it should be very natural, it should be very relaxed. If the breathing system is regulated, whole body mechanism becomes so relaxed, so effortless, so natural, like a flow. But when in some cases I have seen the beginners, they sit with so upright, or big bulging muscles, means they were making so much of effort to sit straight and look green. But then that is certainly good for those who have never even done that much. But the higher level prayers become more effective when we are alone in communion with God. So Sri Ramakrishna gives some very interesting and very illustrative examples here. When plants are young, they have need of a hedge to be set about them for their protection, or else goats and cows will eat them up. The mind, the retired corner, the forest are the three places of meditation. Mind, in our own mind, or in a solitary place, or in the forest. If it is in our home, it can be in our own room, in the privacy of our own room, we can pray. Or if you are sitting in an office, if you feel you get a chance, the right time for prayer, you can try to turn the mind towards God. It becomes prayer. Or in the forests. But the company of like-minded spiritual seekers will create a natural spiritual vibration which will help us to naturally go to a meditative mood. One must also practice discrimination between the real, that is God, and the unreal, the phenomenal world. So that's a very important point. Normally, we take an interest only in those things which we consider to be real. See, greedy people fight over money because for them money is the absolute reality. They may be reading books, they may be well-educated people, well-educated enough to understand that money is not everything. Money will not bring eternal peace. But while indulged in those activities, when they go out of their way to make money and to fight for money, money is the absolute reality. So whatever we consider to be the real, we normally turn our mind towards that. So these phenomenal, empirical things, objects of enjoyment, many of these things may be needed for common people, especially householders. When they live in this world, it's needed. But while living in this world, in the midst of all these necessities, in the midst of all duties and responsibilities related to secular material life, if they keep in mind the idea, well, all these things are transitory, of transitory value. They are not everlasting. This idea should be kept somewhere in a corner of our mind. Then we will be able to meditate more with greater concentration on God. So that's a point which Ramakrishna makes on several occasions, especially when he talks to people. When you live in the world, with one hand you take the name of the God or take the feet of the Lord, with the other hand you work in this world. So this discrimination is discerning mind, that's meant here. A discerning mind which understands what is real and what is unreal. Thus, a person may be able to shake off his attachment to the things of this world, to wealth, fame, power, and sensory pleasures. That's the thing. Now, Sri Ramakrishna makes an interesting point elsewhere. For the householder, internal renunciation is a very important point. For the monks, external renunciation. That's the point. In fact, in all contexts, we find the internal renunciation is what really counts. So, understanding, discriminating with a discerning mind what is real means being attached to the real, which is actually renunciation. Detachment to the external empirical pleasures means attachment towards the real. That becomes devotion. And once we detach our mind from external objects, mind automatically goes to the real. We don't normally take interest in things that we really understand to be unreal. We can easily find. Whatever we take interest in, we think it is the only reality. Psychologically, this is possible. That's why, people who fail in management training and all that, they are asked to, they are given these training programs. So, in some session where I had to speak a few words on this, not on management but on Gita, these fellows, well-dressed executives, had to stand up and shout themselves, I will succeed 10 times. Means, and they had to believe, they had to delude themselves into thinking that they should succeed, they should make more money, and all these things are wonderful things. This obsession enables them to succeed and brings out the inner faculties into play and that help them to work more efficiently. It is a material level. Similarly, if we can pursue ourselves into thinking, well, all these things, empirical things are, maybe they may be needed, but at the same time, they are not everlasting. They are not real in the absolute sense. They come and they go. We may need them, but we should not be slaves to them. This idea should be kept in mind. That helps us in spiritual life. That is Sri Ramakrishna's instruction. So we'll continue next day. Om Tava Kathamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiredidam Kalmashapaham Sravanamangalam Srimata Tatam Bhuvikranti Bhurida Jana.